The hum of the main array was a constant companion, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and settled deep in my bones. Here, perched above the remote village in valley, single road in and out, I found a peculiar solace in the vast, indifferent expanse of the cosmos. My life was a meticulously calibrated instrument, much like the colossal dish itself. Days bled into nights, marked by the rhythmic flicker of data streams across my monitors, the metallic tang of stale coffee, and the occasional creak of the observatory structure settling against the wind. I was Marcus, and this was my sanctuary, my cage, my entire world. For years, I had chased whispers in the dark, the faint echoes of hydrogen clouds, the distant explosions of supernovae, the cosmic background radiation that was the universe's ancient breath. My work was an endless act of listening, sifting through static for meaning, for anything that deviated from the expected, the predictable. Most nights offered nothing but the familiar, the beautiful, terrifying emptiness. The universe, in its grandest scale, was a silent, sprawling canvas of gas and dust and gravity. It was a known quantity, albeit an impassably large one. My meticulous logs, filled with precise measurements and calculated probabilities, reflected this cosmic monotony. That night, a chill had snaked its way into the control room, despite the whirring servers radiating their usual warmth. My protocols were etched into my mind, a ritual honed over countless solitary hours. Calibrate, scan, filter, analyze, recalibrate. The screens glowed with familiar patterns, background noise, expected astronomical phenomena, the random chatter of distant stars. Then, a flicker. It was almost imperceptible at first, a brief, anomalous spike on a frequency I had pre-selected for its historical quietude. My brow furrowed. A minor instrumental glitch, a stray cosmic ray. I ran the diagnostic sequence, my fingers flying across the keys. The array checked itself, reported perfect operational status. I rescanned the same coordinates, a slow, painstaking sweep. The flicker returned, more pronounced this time. Not a random spike, but a faint, rhythmic pulse. My breath hitched. This was not the chaotic burst of a gamma-ray event, nor the steady hum of a pulsar. This was structured. It was like hearing a complex melody in a field of white noise. My heart gave a strange, lurching thump against my ribs. I leaned closer to the monitor, my face inches from the screen, the cold glass a faint echo of the chill in the room. The signal was weak, barely above the noise floor, but undeniably there. A series of discrete, repeating bursts, each separated by precise, unwavering intervals. I initiated a deeper analysis, pushing the observatory's processing power to its limits. The algorithms struggled, then began to resolve the pattern. It was not random. It was a sequence, intricate and deliberate. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I adjusted the filters, isolating the signal from the surrounding cosmic chatter. The clearer it became, the more impossible it seemed. The signal's origin point was staggering, a region of intergalactic space, billions of light-years away, a gulf where no known stellar nurseries or active galaxies resided. And its structure, it was too complex, too ordered, to be a natural phenomenon. My scientific training screamed at me to find a mundane explanation, a fault in my equipment, a misinterpretation of data. But every test I ran, every cross-reference I performed, only solidified the impossible truth. I spent the next several hours in a frantic, almost obsessive cycle of verification. I checked the array's alignment, its temperature, its power output. I recalibrated every sensor, every receiver. I cross-referenced the signal's frequency against known terrestrial interference, against satellite transmissions, against every possible source of error I could conceive. Nothing. The signal persisted, unwavering, impassably ancient, undeniably structured. My muscles ached from the prolonged tension, my eyes burned from staring at the screens. The low hum of the observatory, once a comfort, now seemed to vibrate with a new, unsettling energy. I was alone, miles from the nearest human contact, in the remote village in valley, single road in and out, with a discovery that felt like a secret burning under my skin. This wasn't just a discovery. It was an anomaly that defied every principle I knew. It wasn't a blip, it was a message. What kind of architect could construct such a thing, and for what purpose across the eons? The vast, inky blackness of the night sky seemed to press in on the glass, no longer a comforting blanket, but a profound, hungry maw. What had I just woken? My life was a solitary pursuit, distilled to the raw data streaming into the observatory. The low, resonant thrum of the main array, a constant companion, vibrated through the floorboards and settled deep in my bones, a counterpoint to the profound silence of the remote village in valley, single road in and out, far below. It was a silence I had chosen, a vast, indifferent expanse of cosmos above, a quiet, almost forgotten world below. Here I found a peculiar solace, or so I told myself, in the vast, indifferent expanse of the cosmos. The signal. It wasn't just noise, wasn't just a random burst of cosmic static. It was structured, impossibly so. My fingers, accustomed to the cool, smooth surfaces of keyboards and optical mice, moved with a newfound urgency. Sleep became a luxury, then a forgotten concept. The only rhythm I followed was the relentless cadence of the incoming data, its alien song humming through the processing units. I began with the basics, applying every statistical analysis tool, every pattern recognition algorithm I had ever developed or encountered. The first layer peeled back, revealing not a simple binary code, but something far more complex. It was a nested structure, like a fractal, where patterns repeated not identically, but with subtle, evolving variations. Each iteration added another layer of bewildering complexity, folding back on itself in ways that defied the very principles of information compression I understood. My workstation glowed, an island of artificial light, in the encroaching pre-dawn gloom. The air grew stale with the scent of ozone and stale coffee, a metallic tang that seemed to catch in my throat. My eyes burned, gritty and dry, but I couldn't look away. I saw symmetries, not just mathematical but almost aesthetic. There were sequences that mirrored each other across vast stretches of time, yet were subtly different, as if evolving. It wasn't a language, not in any terrestrial sense. There were no discernible morphemes, no syntax I could grasp. Yet, there was an unmistakable intent, a deliberate arrangement. The thought pricked at the back of my mind, a tiny, sharp needle of unease. Intent implied an intelligence. I started sketching the patterns by hand, filling reams of paper with intricate diagrams, trying to find a Rosetta Stone in the bewildering cascade of information. My hand cramped, but the physical act of drawing seemed to etch the patterns deeper into my consciousness. One particular sequence, recurring irregularly, fascinated and repelled me. It wasn't a simple repetition. It was a theme, a motif that shifted and changed, always recognizable, yet never identical. It was like a melody played on an instrument with an infinite number of keys, each note carrying an echo of the last, but twisted, subtly altered. The more I delved, the more my conventional understanding of information theory crumbled. This wasn't just advanced encoding. It was a fundamental reimagining of how data could be organized. It was as if the signal operated on a logic entirely alien, built upon principles that our physics hadn't even begun to theorize. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes that radiated down my neck. I felt a growing tightness in my chest, a sensation akin to trying to breathe thin, cold air at high altitude. Days blurred into nights. The sun would rise, painting the snow-capped peaks surrounding the remote village in valley, single road in and out in hues of pink and gold, and I would still be hunched over my monitors, the only sound the whirring of the servers and the frantic clicking of my mouse. My colleagues, if they could be called that, were distant figures, voices on a crackling line, their questions about anomalous energy readings and potential gravitational wave signatures sounding trivial, almost childish, against the profound mystery unfolding before me. I offered them vague reassurances, citing equipment calibration and atmospheric interference. They didn't understand. They couldn't. I ran it through a new filter, one I'd designed to look for non-linear relationships, hidden correlations. The screen flickered, then resolved into a visual representation that made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just a pattern anymore. It was a structure, a lattice, impassably intricate, self-sustaining and expanding. It appeared to describe something. Not a picture, not a blueprint, but a set of fundamental relationships. It was a language of pure logic, but a logic so vast, so encompassing, it made our most profound mathematical theories seem like nursery rhymes. My fingers trembled as I zoomed in, then out, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the implied information. Each node in the lattice was a concept, each connection a relationship, and the entire structure seemed to describe a reality, or a set of rules for a reality, that was both alien and disturbingly coherent. It wasn't just telling me about something. It was subtly, insidiously, recontextualizing everything I thought I knew. The air in the lab grew heavy, charged like before a storm. The signal had become an anchor, dragging my mind deeper into an unknown ocean. Its precise, alien rhythm, once a scientific marvel, now felt like a taunt. I had spent weeks in my observatory, the low, resonant thrum of the main array vibrating through the floorboards and settling deep in my bones, a counterpoint to the profound silence of the remote village in valley, single road in and out. The data streams, meticulously analyzed, yielded no terrestrial explanation. No known celestial body, no recognized physical phenomenon could produce such an impassably ancient, structured broadcast. My equations, once elegant tools, now felt like flimsy nets thrown into a hurricane. A gnawing unease had begun to displace my scientific curiosity. It wasn't just the age of the signal, billions of years older than any star in our galaxy, but the intent I felt woven into its patterns. It wasn't random noise. It was a language, vast and indifferent, speaking of something utterly beyond human comprehension. Sleep became a battle against phantom echoes, against the feeling of infinite cold pressing in from the void. My hands, once steady, sometimes trembled when I stared at the shimmering spectral lines on my monitors. My scientific rigor, my very identity, felt like it was dissolving. The signal was demanding something more, something older. I needed to look elsewhere, beyond the polished steel and glowing screens of my instruments. I needed to find a different kind of knowledge, forgotten and perhaps dangerous. The decision felt like a surrender, a step away from everything I had ever believed. I left the observatory, the hum of the array fading behind me like a dying heartbeat. The single road that led into the remote village in valley, single road in and out, was gravel, winding between skeletal trees. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The village itself was a collection of ancient stone cottages huddled against the elements, their windows like vacant eyes. It was a place where time seemed to fold in on itself, where old stories still clung to the air like mist. I remembered a small, unassuming shop I'd passed occasionally, its windows perpetually grimy, filled with an impassable jumble of dusty relics. It wasn't a library, not in the academic sense, but a repository of forgotten things. The sign above the door, faded to illegibility, suggested it was an antiquarian's establishment. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of aged paper, dry dust, and something else, a faint metallic tang like old coins or dried blood. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step a protest. From behind a leaning tower of leather-bound volumes, a figure emerged. He was an old man, stooped, with eyes like polished stones that seemed to absorb what little light there was. His clothes were rumpled tweed, and his skin was parchment-thin, etched with a lifetime of quiet observation. He didn't speak, merely watched me with an unsettling patience. I'm looking for something," I began, my voice sounding oddly loud in the stillness. "Something old, not history, not science, something symbolic. Diagrams, perhaps, or texts that speak of things that don't fit, patterns that defy explanation." The antiquarian's gaze held mine, unblinking. He slowly nodded, a barely perceptible movement. He turned without a word and shuffled deeper into the labyrinth of his collection. I followed, my senses overwhelmed by the sheer volume of forgotten history surrounding me. Every object seemed to hum with a silent story. He stopped at a shelf filled with brittle-looking scrolls and unbound folios. With surprising delicacy, he pulled down a large, heavy tome, its cover worn smooth, its binding cracked. He laid it on a scarred wooden table, stirring a cloud of fine, grey dust that caught the weak light. The pages were a faded, yellowed canvas, covered in intricate, looping script I couldn't understand. But it wasn't the script that caught my eye. Near the center of one particular spread, drawn in a pigment that had long since faded to a muted ochre, was a diagram. It wasn't an illustration of an animal or a star chart. It was a complex, interlocking pattern of lines and curves, utterly abstract, yet radiating a terrible sense of order. My breath hitched, my vision blurred for a moment. I leaned closer, my heart thudding against my ribs with a frantic, irregular beat. The pattern. I had seen it before. Not in a book, not in a museum. The fundamental structure, the recurring motifs, the strange, asymmetrical symmetry, it was all there. A perfect, terrifying match. This diagram, drawn by human hands centuries, perhaps millennia ago, mirrored the cosmic geometry of something billions of years old. My hands clenched, grip tight, as I fought the urge to recoil. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a direct link, a thread connecting the furthest reaches of spacetime to some forgotten, primal understanding here on Earth. How could this be? What terrible, forbidden knowledge had been preserved in this dusty tome, waiting for me to stumble upon it? And what did it mean that humanity had once known, and then forgotten, the shape of something so profoundly alien? My fingers brushed against rough-spun cloth, then the brittle spine of a leather-bound volume that crumbled slightly at my touch. The air in the antiquarian's shop was thick, a cloying blend of dust, aged paper, and something metallic, like forgotten copper. It clung to the back of my throat, a taste of history decaying. The antiquarian, a hunched silhouette against the dim light filtering through a grimy skylight, led me deeper into his domain. Shelves groaned under the weight of countless forgotten objects. Maps yellowed with time, telescopes with tarnished brass, strange wooden carvings that seemed to shift their forms in my peripheral vision. Each step I took stirred motes of dust that danced in the weak light, tiny, ephemeral galaxies. He stopped before a towering shelf, reaching with a gnarled hand for a book that seemed to melt into the shadows. Its cover was unadorned, a dark, featureless hide, and its pages, when he finally placed it in my hands, felt like dried leaves, rustling with an unheard whisper. There was no title, no author, only a series of faint, almost invisible symbols pressed into the cover, like scars on ancient stone. They were not hieroglyphs I recognized, nor any known script. They simply were. He said nothing, merely watched me with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. I didn't ask the price. I simply paid, the transaction silent, the weight of the book in my hands, heavier than its physical mass suggested. The drive back to my isolated dwelling, nestled in the heart of the remote village in valley, single road in and out, felt longer than usual. The familiar winding road, usually a comforting ribbon of asphalt, now seemed to stretch into an endless, featureless expanse. My mind, usually a precise instrument, felt clouded, a film of unease clinging to its edges. Back in my lab, the book lay on my desk, an inert block of forbidden knowledge. I tried to ignore it, to immerse myself in the familiar hum of my equipment, the crisp data readouts from the signal. But the subtle shifts began almost immediately. I reached for my coffee mug, left precisely on the right side of my keyboard, only to find it on the left, its handle rotated 90 degrees. A minor detail, easily dismissed as my own absent-mindedness, a lapse in concentration. Yet, a faint tremor ran through me. I was meticulous, almost pathologically so, in my lab. Every tool had its place, every note its designated position. Later that evening, as I reviewed star charts, a fleeting distortion caught my eye. The wall, a solid expanse of painted plaster, seemed to ripple for a fraction of a second, like water disturbed by an unseen stone. The pattern of its imperfections, the tiny cracks and dust motes, momentarily rearranged themselves into an impassable geometry, a non-Euclidean tangle that defied spatial logic. My breath hitched. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The wall was perfectly normal, solid and unyielding. The image, however, persisted in my mind's eye, a lingering afterimage of something fundamentally wrong. My hands grew clammy, my pulse quickened, a frantic drum against my ribs. Sleep offered no escape. The dreams began, not as vague anxieties or fragmented memories, but as direct, vivid intrusions. The air was still silent, yet I felt a pressure, an immense unseen presence. They were not built of stone or metal, but of pure concept, vast equations made manifest, twisting and unfolding in a way that defied all perception of depth and dimension. My mind struggled to grasp them, to categorize them, but they were beyond comprehension. Their edges were too sharp, their curves too perfect, their scale too immense. I felt my sanity fraying at the edges, stretched thin by the sheer impossibility of what I witnessed. As I watched, the light began to unravel, not breaking apart, but undoing itself, its constituent photons seeming to reverse their paths, shrinking, disappearing. The next morning, the distortions continued. My key ring, which I'd left on the kitchen counter, was hanging from the doorknob. A book I'd been reading was open to a different page than where I'd marked it, page with an illustration I swore wasn't there before a series of interlocking, impassable shapes, identical to those I'd glimpsed on the wall and in my dreams. It was no longer just a trick of the light or a lapse in memory. Something was subtly, irrevocably, altering the fabric of my immediate reality. They were too specific, too unsettling, too intertwined with the abstract geometries I'd begun to perceive. They felt like echoes, like ripples in a pond, emanating from the signal, from the forbidden knowledge I was now privy to. It was as if the entity, the source of that impassably ancient transmission, was not merely broadcasting data, but was subtly, insidiously, reaching out, touching my world, my mind. It was testing the boundaries, probing the edges of my perception. Was I merely sleep-deprived, my mind playing tricks on me, or was something truly beginning to unravel? The metallic tang from the antiquarian's shop still ghosted on my tongue, a bitter aftertaste to the unsettling revelations the proprietor had hinted at. He had scrawled an address on a brittle scrap of parchment, his eyes darting, as if the very act of writing invited scrutiny. "He knows things," the antiquarian had whispered, his voice dry as aged paper. "Things best left undisturbed. But if I insist on looking, he's the only one left who might see what I read chasing." My journey to the remote village in valley, single road in and out, was a slow, deliberate crawl through a landscape that seemed to shed its vibrancy with every mile. The highway thinned into a cracked asphalt ribbon, then a gravel track that snaked precariously along the edge of a deep chasm. Grey, skeletal trees clawed a perpetually overcast sky, their branches rattling like dry bones in the persistent wind. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. My breath plumed in front of me, a small, transient cloud in the vast, indifferent emptiness. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of my tires and the occasional, unsettling shriek of something unseen in the distant, shadowed woods. I felt the familiar hum of the signal in the back of my mind, a subtle pressure behind my eyes, as if the universe itself was trying to push a truth into my skull. The village clung to the valley floor like a forgotten scab, a cluster of weathered stone and timber structures huddled against the encroaching wild. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, thin threads against the bruised sky. No children played in the narrow, muddy lanes. No dogs barked. A single, rusted sign marked the entrance, Eldridge's End. The name itself felt like a warning. I drove past shuttered windows, past a general store with a faded awning, its door firmly closed. The few figures I saw were hunched, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats, their gazes averted. They moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if every step was an effort against an invisible current. The address led me to the last house on the single road, perched on the absolute edge of the village, where the forest began its silent, watchful advance. It was a squat, two-story affair, its stone walls stained with moss and lichen, its windows like vacant eyes. A warped wooden fence, missing several slats, leaned precariously around a patch of overgrown weeds that might once have been a garden. The front door, painted a faded, peeling green, sagged on its hinges. A faint, acrid smell, like burnt sugar mixed with something metallic, drifted from within. What kind of knowledge awaited me inside such a place? I pushed the door inward. It groaned in protest, scraping against the floorboards. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the same cloying scent I'd noticed outside, intensified now, mixed with the unmistakable aroma of old paper and something else, a faint, almost sickly sweetness. The room I entered was a chaos of books, stacked precariously on every available surface, spilling onto the floor in teetering towers. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy windows. In the center of this academic disarray sat the former academic, hunched over a rickety table piled high with more books and loose papers. He was a gaunt figure, his hair a wild silver halo around a deeply furrowed brow. He lifted his head slowly, his gaze fixing on me. It felt less like being seen and more like being dissected. The current pulls them in eventually. He listened, his head cocked slightly, a strange, knowing smile playing on his lips. His right eye twitched almost imperceptibly. Patterns, he repeated, drawing out the word like a fragile thread. Oh yes, patterns are the hooks, aren't they? The bait. They promise order, reveal structure, then they show I the seams. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, though no one else was present. The seams where reality frays, where the great weaver's hand slips. He gestured vaguely at the stacks of books. They called me mad, I know, dismissed my work, said I chased ghosts in the data. But the ghosts are real, Marcus. They're just not dead. There, elsewhere, waiting for the right frequency. His eyes, unnervingly bright, bored into mine. I've heard the song, haven't I? The one that doesn't belong. The one that hums in the spaces between the stars where nothing should be. It's not a signal, not as I understand it. It's a correction, a fundamental retuning. My stomach clenched. He was speaking my language, but twisting it into something monstrous. The universe isn't stable, he continued, his voice rising slightly. It's a construct, a fragile tapestry woven from rules we barely comprehend, and something out there. It doesn't like the pattern. It seeks to undo the knots, to pull the threads apart. Not to destroy, Marcus, but to reorder. They leave their marks in the data. They show us what lies beyond the limits of our perception. And the more we see, the more we understand that our reality is just one interpretation, one fragile dream. A tremor ran through me. This was what I had feared, a confirmation of the deepest, most unspeakable anxieties that the signal had awakened. He was articulating the very horror I had struggled to put into words. The knowledge isn't forbidden because it's dangerous. The former academic said, his gaze fixed on the wooden figure. It's forbidden because it's true. And the truth unravels everything I think I am, everything we believe exists. He finally looked back at me, his eyes wide and vacant, yet filled with a terrible, ancient understanding. What happens, Marcus, when the very laws of physics begin to weep? His question hung in the stale air, thick with the scent of decay and forgotten knowledge. What indeed? My colleague's question, what indeed? Echoed in the sterile air of the observation chamber, a fragile barrier against the vastness I now felt pressing in. I didn't answer. My gaze remained fixed on the console, the flickering lines of the signal now seeming less like data and more like a presence. The metallic tang in my mouth intensified, a taste of cold dread. I spent the next several days in a blur, the signal a relentless, buzzing companion in my skull. I dismissed my colleague with a curt explanation about needing absolute solitude for deep-level pattern recognition. He looked at me, a flicker of concern in his eyes, but ultimately retreated, leaving me to the relentless hum of the equipment and the growing silence of the facility. I needed to escape the main complex. The sheer scale of the signal, its impassable antiquity, felt too large for the contained environment. I packed a few essentials, my most powerful processors, and drove. My destination was a small, isolated cabin I owned in the remote village in Valley, single road in and out. This place, nestled deep within forgotten mountains, was where I usually sought solace, a refuge for thought. Now, it felt like a deliberate act of self-imprisonment, a place where I could be truly alone with the thing I had found. The cabin was rustic, built of rough-hewn timber, smelling of pine and damp earth. No internet, no distractions, just the raw computing power I'd brought and the endless, silent expanse outside. I set up my makeshift lab on the old wooden table, cables snaking across the floor, the hum of the processors, a stark contrast to the chirping crickets outside. I pored over the data. Days bled into nights. Coffee became a bitter constant. My fingers, stained with ink and grime, danced across the keyboard, isolating frequencies, layering patterns, searching for any logical sequence. Initially, I approached it as a complex mathematical construct, a cosmic cipher. I tried every known algorithm, every theoretical framework for interstellar communication. Nothing fit. The patterns were too fluid, too adaptive, too organic. The signal wasn't merely structured, it was sculpted. Each peak and trough, each subtle shift in amplitude seemed to carry an intentionality that defied random cosmic phenomena. It began to feel less like data points and more like inflections, like tones in a vast, impassable symphony. My eyes burned, tracing the oscillations on the display, a dizzying dance of light. Then I isolated a repeating motif. Not a simple loop, but a complex, evolving pattern that returned to a foundational structure, like a theme in a musical piece. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, buried beneath layers of what I had initially dismissed as noise. But once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. It was a rhythm, a cadence, an alien melody sung across unimaginable distances. I began to map these motifs, assigning them symbolic representations based on their recurring contexts within the larger signal. It was a leap of faith, a desperate attempt to impose meaning where none should exist. But the patterns, once seen, became undeniable. There were repetitions that suggested emphasis, variations that implied grammatical shifts. It was a language, not of words, but of pure vibrational intent. And it was ancient beyond human comprehension. The timescale implied by its structure, its slow, deliberate evolution, spoke of epochs stretching into geological time. It was the song of something that had existed before stars coalesced, before the very concept of life had stirred in the cosmic dust. My breath hitched in my throat as I finally pieced together the first coherent fragment. It wasn't a message in any conventional sense. It was a declaration, a fundamental truth not spoken, but manifested through the very fabric of the signal. Reordering. This wasn't a scientific discovery, it was an intrusion. This wasn't an observation, it was a revelation. My mind struggled to grasp the implications. Correction of what? Reordering of what? The very laws of physics, the structure of reality itself. The cabin air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something acrid and metallic, like old blood. My ears rang with the echo of the signal, no longer just on the speakers, but deep within my skull. It felt like a direct address. It felt like it was speaking to me. I stared at the glowing screen, the alien patterns pulsing with a newfound, terrifying vitality. It wasn't just ancient, it was aware. And it had found me. What did it want me to do with its song? The static hiss of the receivers had become a living thing, a whisper against the walls of my skull. It wasn't just the void between galaxies singing anymore. It was singing to me, through me. My hands, still trembling from the previous night's revelation, felt foreign, disconnected. The entity's purpose wasn't merely observed, it was imprinted. A fundamental change, but what change and to what? Sleep offered no respite. The edges of my vision blurred, shimmering like heat haze over asphalt. I saw patterns in the dust motes dancing in the meager sunlight, intricate geometries that shifted and reformed, hinting at impassable angles. My coffee tasted like ash, though I knew it was freshly brewed. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks. It was something else, something external, yet deeply internal. The signal, once a beacon of scientific wonder, was now a constant pressure behind my eyes. I found myself staring at the wall, seeing the paint peel in patterns that formed fleeting, unsettling symbols. My fingers traced the rough plaster, feeling ridges that weren't there a moment before. The hum of my equipment seemed to synchronize with the pulse in my temples. Was it my pulse, or was it the equipment? The distinction blurred, but the numbers danced. They rearranged themselves on the screen, forming sequences that made no logical sense, yet felt profoundly significant. A prime number would suddenly become composite, then revert, then twist into a glyph I couldn't comprehend. My head ached with the effort of trying to pin down what I saw, what I knew to be true, against what my eyes insisted was happening. One afternoon, the hunger became too much to ignore. I needed supplies from the remote village in valley, single road in and out. The thought of leaving my sanctuary, even for a short trip, filled me with a primal unease. The world outside felt thinner, less substantial. It was just a trip, a necessary, mundane task. The drive was a test of will. The trees lining the winding road seemed to lean in, their branches weaving together in impassable tangles, forming tunnels that never quite ended. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Every reflection in the rearview mirror seemed to hold a fleeting, distorted image of something behind me, just out of focus. A flicker of movement. When I finally reached the village, the familiar sight of the general store offered a brief, fragile sense of normalcy. I parked my vehicle and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air felt heavy, still, despite the faint breeze rustling through the leaves. I could hear the distant lowing of cattle, the faint clang of metal from a workshop down the street, all ordinary sounds. But beneath them I detected a faint, almost subliminal thrumming, like a colossal, buried engine. Inside the store, the proprietor, a stout, quiet man I'd known for years, looked up as I entered. His gaze, usually calm and steady, seemed to linger on me for a moment too long. A flicker of something in his eyes, concern or something else. I couldn't tell. My paranoia tightened its grip. He seemed to move strangely, his limbs elongating, his head subtly tilting at an unnatural angle before snapping back to normal. A trick of the light, I told myself, or maybe my vision was just strained. I grabbed a few essentials, my hands shaking as I placed them on the counter. The proprietor bagged them silently. His fingers, I noticed, seemed to stretch, growing thin and translucent at the tips before solidifying again. I blinked hard. The illusion vanished. But the memory of it, the feeling of seeing it, remained. It was so vivid, too vivid to be dismissed as mere imagination. "Everything all right, Marcus?" the proprietor asked, his voice a low rumble. I nearly jumped. He hadn't spoken to me in years, beyond a simple price total. "Fine," I managed, my voice raspy. "Just, how did he know?" I rarely spoke to anyone about my work, about my isolation. "Just focused," I replied, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. As I left the store, the thrumming intensified. It felt like it was coming from the ground itself, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. The sky above the valley seemed to ripple, the clouds forming into impassable, swirling patterns that defied meteorology. I scrambled back into my vehicle, fumbling with the keys. My hands were slick with sweat. The engine roared to life, a comforting sound against the rising tide of internal chaos. I glanced back at the village in my rearview mirror. The houses, the trees, the very ground seemed to subtly shimmer, like an image reflected on disturbed water. The road leading out, the single thread connecting me to this semblance of reality, seemed to waver, stretching and contracting. Back at the observatory, the familiar instruments now pulsed with an alien light. My screens, which had displayed data, now showed fragmented images, symbols that twisted and reformed, not unlike the clouds I had seen. The signal was no longer just a frequency, it was a presence. It was in the air, in the walls, in the very marrow of my bones. It was in my perception. I walked to the main console, my legs feeling heavy, as if moving through deep water. The monitors displayed a swirling vortex of colors, interspersed with the impassable geometric patterns I'd been seeing. But this time, they were clearer, sharper. I could almost reach out and touch them. They felt real. And then, at the very center of the swirling chaos, a single, clear image coalesced. Not a symbol, not a pattern, a word, or something that resembled one. It wasn't in any language I knew, yet its meaning resonated with an awful certainty in my mind. Correct. The word pulsed, expanding, filling my vision. I clutched the console, my grip tight, trying to ground myself. Was this the entity's influence, manifesting directly in my sight? Or was my mind simply unraveling, twisting everything I saw and heard into a reflection of its insidious purpose? What part of me was still truly mine? The thrumming followed me. It wasn't just the ground. It was the air, the very bones in my skull. I clutched the bag of groceries, the plastic crinkling like dry leaves in a phantom breeze. The remote village in valley, single road in and out, seemed to hold its breath. The usual quiet, a blanket woven from the distant hum of the forest and the occasional bark of a dog, had been replaced by this low, resonant vibration. It was a chord struck deep beneath the earth, rising to meet something unseen in the sky. I quickened my pace, the gravel crunching under my worn boots. My small cabin, nestled at the edge of the tree line, offered little refuge from the growing unease. Inside, the thrumming intensified, rattling the glass in the window panes. A ceramic mug on my desk skidded an inch to the left, then back again, as if nudged by an invisible hand. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a tremor, it was a rhythmic pulse, growing stronger, more defined. My instruments, usually a source of comfort, now felt like complicit observers. The screens flickered, displaying erratic spikes in atmospheric pressure and subtle shifts in the local gravitational field. I watched the readings, my mind racing. A few weeks ago, these fluctuations would have been dismissed as equipment malfunction, a quirk of my aging sensors. But now, after the signal, after the whispers from the void, I knew better. This was a response. It was interaction. I spent the next few hours poring over the data, cross-referencing, recalibrating. The spikes weren't random. They were occurring with increasing frequency, centered around a specific vector in the sky, the very direction from which the original signal had emanated. My fingers trembled as I highlighted the trend. The patterns were too complex, too structured to be natural phenomena. They were precise, almost deliberate, like a hand reaching. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and angry oranges. The thrumming intensified with the encroaching darkness, a low, guttural growl that resonated in my chest. I felt it in my teeth, a dull ache that spread through my jaw. My cabin, usually a sanctuary, felt like a flimsy shell against an encroaching tide. I stared out the window, past the dense firs, towards the distant horizon where the first stars began to prickle through the twilight. The air itself seemed to shimmer, an almost imperceptible distortion that made the distant mountains waver like a reflection in disturbed water. There was I imagining it. My eyes burned from staring at screens. My mind felt stretched, thin. A sudden, sharp crack split the air, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. It was followed by a series of smaller, popping sounds. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. A framed photograph of my parents, usually leaning securely against a stack of books, had toppled over. The glass was spiderwebbed with cracks. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the jagged lines. It hadn't fallen, it had been shaken, violently. I stumbled back to my workstation, my movements jerky. The gravitational readings were off the charts. For a fraction of a second, the gravity in my cabin had dropped by nearly 3%, then surged back with an equal, opposite force. My stomach churned. This wasn't just a ripple, it was a localized, tangible effect. It was getting closer, whatever it was. I pulled up the long-range atmospheric sensors. The image was grainy but undeniable. A vast circular distortion, hundreds of kilometers across, was manifesting in the upper atmosphere. It wasn't a cloud formation. It wasn't an aurora. It was a region where light seemed to bend, where air currents spun in impassable spirals, where the very fabric of the sky seemed to ripple like stretched canvas. And it was expanding, steadily, inexorably. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a signal. It wasn't a message from a distant, indifferent intelligence. This was an approach. The entity wasn't merely broadcasting its existence across the cosmos. It was actively making its presence known, physically altering the reality around it, towards Earth. The thrumming became a roar, vibrating through the floorboards, through the chair I sat on, through my very bones. Every object in the cabin rattled. Outside, the trees swayed, not with wind, but with an unseen pressure. I could hear the distant groan of timbers from the village below, the frantic barking of dogs turning into desperate howls. My hands flew across the keyboard, trying to make sense of the new data, the accelerating pace of the phenomena. The atmospheric distortion was now clearly visible to the naked eye, a vast, circular shadow blotting out the stars, a patch of absolute blackness against the already dark sky. It wasn't a cloud, because it moved against the wind, expanding with a terrifying, silent intent. This was no longer abstract. This was here, now. The entity wasn't just a theoretical construct of cosmic horror, it was a physical presence, asserting itself, pushing its way into our reality. It felt like standing at the bottom of a deep well, waiting for something immense to drop. I looked at the distorted sky, at the frantic readings on my monitors. The source of the signal was no longer billions of light years away. It was, in some terrifying, incomprehensible way, right above me. What would happen when it fully arrived? The usual quiet, a blanket woven from the distant chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves, had been torn. Now, an oppressive, low-frequency hum vibrated through everything. It wasn't loud, not in a way that would make a casual passerby notice, but it was there, a deep, resonant pressure against my eardrums, behind my eyes. It felt like the world itself was being tuned to a wrong frequency. My small cottage, nestled at the edge of the remote village in valley, single road in and out, offered no respite. The wooden floorboards hummed beneath my bare feet. The ceramic mugs on the kitchen shelf rattled with a faint, incessant tremor. I tried to ignore it, to rationalize it as residual anxiety, a phantom limb of sound from too many hours spent hunched over the signal data. But the reality was starker, colder. The signal wasn't just data anymore. It was a presence, seeping into the physical world, twisting the familiar. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. The fear had curdled into a desperate resolve. I had to tell someone, not just about the signal, not just about the impassable structure or the ancient origin, but about the feeling, the way reality felt thin, stretched, the thrumming. My fingers trembled as I dialed the number. It was late, but I knew the senior researcher, a night owl like me, would still be at his terminal. The phone rang, a tinny, almost forgotten sound against the pervasive hum of my cottage. "Marcus, do you know what time it is?" The senior researcher's voice, thick with irritation and the static crackle of a bad connection, cut through the quiet. "It's important," I blurted, my voice tight, too loud in the silent room. "It's about the signal. It's manifesting." A pause, a sigh heavy with exhaustion. "Manifesting, Marcus? What are you talking about? The last data packet you sent was intriguing, yes, but it was just that. Data. Anomalous, perhaps, but within the realm of theoretical physics." "No, you don't understand," I pressed, my throat constricting. "It's not theoretical anymore. It's here. I can hear it. I can feel it. This deep, low thrumming everywhere. The remote village in valley, single road in and out. My cottage. It's like the fundamental fabric of existence is." I heard the faint clack of keys on his end, then a rustle of papers. "Marcus," his voice was softer now, but laced with a new, dangerous quality, pity. "Are I getting enough sleep? I've been isolated for months out there. Affect one's perception." "My perception is fine," I snapped, frustration coiling in my gut. "I'm telling this is real. The entity isn't just a pattern in the data. It's acting. It's changing things. It's correcting reality like it wants to smooth out the wrinkles, and we're the wrinkles." A short, sharp laugh. "Correcting reality. Marcus, this sounds like an elaborate delusion. I respect my dedication, my brilliance, but I rare veering into the territory of unscientific speculation. We deal with observable phenomena, testable hypotheses, not cosmic entities correcting reality. But the data supports it," I pleaded, clutching the phone so hard my grip tightened. "The patterns, the impassable structure, the way it encodes information about universal constants. It's a blueprint for a different kind of reality, and it's being implemented." "Marcus, I'm going to be frank." The senior researcher's voice hardened again. "I sound like I rare having a breakdown. I'm concerned. Perhaps I should take a leave of absence. Step away from the observatory, from the data, get some rest. Well, just get some rest." My breath hitched. He wasn't hearing me. He wasn't even trying to hear me. If I'm right, everything is at stake. "If you're right, Marcus, you've stumbled onto the most revolutionary discovery in human history. But what you're describing now is not a discovery. It's a hallucination. There's no scientific basis for a thrumming that only you can perceive. I can't put my name on that. No one will." The line clicked, then went dead. He had hung up. My hand fell, the receiver clattering against the small wooden table. The thrumming in the room seemed to intensify, marking my pleas. I tried another contact, a former colleague from a different institution, someone I'd collaborated with on a minor project years ago. This time, the conversation was shorter, more abrupt. The colleague listened patiently for a few minutes, interjecting with polite, non-committal murmurs. Then, when I mentioned the thrumming, the corrections, the unraveling, her voice grew distant. She spoke of stress, of the pressures of isolated research, of needing a break. She promised to look into my data, a promise I knew was empty. She ended the call quickly, citing an urgent meeting. They thought I was mad, every single one of them. The scientific community, my peers, the people who were supposed to understand the profound implications of my work. They saw a brilliant mind unraveling, not a man bearing a terrible truth. My eyes scanned the room, the familiar objects now alien under the constant, low tremor. The thrumming was a physical weight now, pressing against my temples, blurring the edges of my vision. It felt like the air itself was thickening, becoming viscous. The remote village in valley, single road in and out, seemed to shrink around me, its single road no longer an escape route, but a tether holding me to this vibrating, uncertain reality. I was alone, utterly, terribly alone. What could I do, a single voice against the deaf ears of the world, when the world itself was beginning to hum a song of its own undoing? The line clicked, then went dead. He had hung up. My chest felt hollow, cold. I tried another contact, a former colleague from a different institution, someone I'd trusted with sensitive data before. His number rang, then a strange, distorted noise like grinding teeth filled the line before it too went dead. No dial tone, nothing, just a flat, oppressive silence from the device itself. I stared at the plastic receiver in my hand, its weight suddenly foreign. Outside, the wind howled, a thin, desolate sound that matched the emptiness inside me. I was in the remote village in valley, single road in and out, where I'd hoped to find some quiet, some distance from the city's constant clamor. Now, that isolation felt like a cage. I tried the television. The screen flickered to life, a static-laced image of a news anchor, her face pale, her lips moving without sound. I fiddled with the volume, but only a low, persistent hum emanated from the speakers, a sound that seemed to vibrate in concert with the thrumming in my skull. Then, the image on the screen lurched. The news anchor's face elongated, her eyes sliding upwards on her skull, as if her features were wet clay being stretched by an invisible hand. The background, a cityscape, rippled, buildings folding in on themselves, then expanding into impassable angles that defied perspective. A bridge in the distance warped into a series of disconnected segments, each floating independently before snapping back, just as unnaturally into place. My breath hitched. This wasn't a broadcast error. This was wrong. Thrumming in the room pulsed, a low, resonant beat that I could feel in my teeth. I stumbled back from the television, my heart racing. My hands were shaking, a fine tremor that ran through my entire body. I gripped the edge of my desk, the wood cool beneath my clammy fingers. I needed air. I needed to see something real, something solid. I walked to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtain. The valley, usually a comforting expanse of green and brown, was now a dizzying patchwork. A distant mountain peak, one I knew intimately, appeared to have shifted. The sun itself was a dull, bruised purple, not the brilliant gold I expected. My mind screamed. I turned on the radio, desperate for any human voice, any confirmation that what I was seeing wasn't just my own mind fracturing. The signal was weak, filled with hiss and crackle, but I caught fragments. A frantic voice, identifying herself as a reporter, was describing widespread anomalies, spoke of clocks running backwards in some regions, then leaping forward by hours in others. She mentioned reports of people vanishing mid-sentence, their clothes falling to the ground like discarded husks. A colleague, she said, had been interviewing a construction worker about a building that had folded into itself, when the worker simply ceased to be. The reporter's voice broke, then cut out, replaced by a low, guttural static that felt like a physical presence in the room. My stomach churned. This was it, the signal. The ancient, impassable signal that had started all of this. It wasn't just a message. It was an influence, a correction, seeping into the very fabric of existence. The fundamental laws, the ones I had dedicated my life to understanding, were unraveling. Gravity, time, space itself, they were no longer constants. They were suggestions, open to revision. The thrumming wasn't just in the room now. It was in the walls, in the floorboards, my very bones. I tried to think, to rationalize, to find a scientific explanation, but the thoughts scattered like dust. How could a mountain simply reshape itself? How could time reverse? These weren't phenomena, they were impossibilities. My own reflection in the window seemed distorted, my features stretched and compressed, a stranger staring back at me from a world that no longer made sense. A sharp pain lanced behind my eyes. We were nothing. Our laws, our understanding, our very existence were just temporary arrangements in a universe far older and far more terrifying than we could ever comprehend. If the rules could be rewritten, what did that make us? And what new rules were being imposed? The line had gone dead, leaving a hollow echo in the small room. My hand, numb and cold, dropped the receiver. It clattered against the wooden table, a sharp, meaningless sound swallowed by the intensifying thrum. It wasn't just in the room anymore. It was in my teeth, behind my eyes, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. I tried to dial again, a different contact this time, a former colleague from a university on the coast, but my fingers felt thick, unresponsive. The numbers blurred. The telephone itself seemed to ripple at the edges of my vision, its plastic shell breathing. I don't remember leaving the house. The next thing I knew, the grinding roar of my old sedan was the only sound cutting through the thrumming in my skull, the only anchor in a world that felt increasingly untethered. The road was a blur of asphalt and fractured yellow lines, leading me deeper into the night, away from everything familiar. I drove until the sun began to paint the eastern sky in bruised purples and grays, until the landscape tightened around me, until I found myself in a remote village in a valley, with only a single road in and out. The air here was thin, sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Mist clung to the valley floor, shrouding the scattered cottages in a veil of grey. Yet beneath it, the thrumming persisted, a deeper, more ancient resonance now, as if the very bedrock of the valley sang with it. I stepped out of the car, my legs stiff, my body a collection of aches. The village seemed deserted. No lights shone from the windows, no smoke curled from chimneys. A single, weathered sign, its paint peeling, proclaimed the village name, but the letters swam before my eyes, shifting, rearranging themselves into impassable glyphs. My hyper-awareness, a cruel gift from the signal, sharpened everything. Each rustle of leaves in the unseen breeze, each drop of dew falling from a pine needle was amplified, distinct. I could hear the slow, deliberate pulse of blood in my own ears, the faint creak of my knee joints as I walked. The ground beneath my worn boots felt impossibly firm, yet simultaneously yielding, as if the earth itself was a living membrane. The distant mountains, jagged teeth against the pale sky, seemed to waver, their peaks subtly altering their geometry, defying perspective. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the effect persisted. A low-lying cloud bank, caught between two prominent peaks, began to churn, not with the natural currents of air, but with an internal, purposeful motion. It was like watching a vast, silent mechanism awaken. The wooden facades, weathered by time, seemed to ripple, the grain twisting into patterns that shouldn't exist. Each plank, each knot, each splinter told a story, not of wood and time, but of something far older, something that had imprinted itself onto reality itself here. I reached out a trembling hand to touch a rough-hewn wall. A subtle vibration, a hum that resonated deep within the timber, a sensation of immense, silent pressure. Then it happened. Not a visual manifestation in the conventional sense, but a rupture in my perception, a tearing of the thin veil between what I knew to be real and what was. The valley, the mountains, the cottages, they didn't just waver or shift. They unfolded. I saw the true form not with my eyes, but with a direct, horrifying apprehension of mind. It was vast beyond comprehension, yet simultaneously contained within the confines of the valley and within my own skull. A non-Euclidean impossibility of form and unform. Not a shape, but a process. It was a constantly reconfiguring lattice of pure abstraction, composed of angles that defied three dimensions, curves that bent back on themselves without intersecting, and negative spaces that suggested volumes larger than the universe itself. My brain screamed, struggling to reconcile the data to fit this infinite, self-contradictory entity into any known framework. It couldn't. And then the understanding. It wasn't merely present, it was acting. Its purpose, clearer than any thought it ever had, was to fundamentally alter, to correct existence itself. Not to destroy, but to remake. To unravel the fundamental laws that governed our reality, the very constants that allowed planets to form, stars to burn, life to emerge. It saw our universe, our concept of space and time, our very being, as an error, a deviation from some ultimate, alien truth, and it was mending it, reweaving the fabric of creation according to its own incomprehensible logic. I saw glimpses of this correction, the sky folding into itself, stars collapsing into impassable points, mountains dissolving into pure information, only to coalesce again in utterly different configurations. My perception of self, of Marcus, flickered, a fragile flame in a hurricane of cosmic reordering. A wave of nausea washed over me, so potent it brought me to my knees. The pine needles pricked my palms through my gloves as I braced myself. My breath hitched in my throat, ragged and shallow. My vision swam, not from fatigue, but from the sheer, overwhelming truth of what I was witnessing. It was here, in this remote valley, quietly, patiently, undoing everything. What would remain when the correction was complete? The thrum no longer just vibrated in my teeth. It resonated in the very marrow of my bones. It was a pressure, a silent scream that tore at the fabric of the air itself, making the small room feel like a drum about to burst. My hand, still numb from the dead receiver, dropped to the table. The wood felt strangely soft beneath my palm, yielding as if its very molecular structure had begun to question its own rigidity. My vision blurred at the edges, not from tears, but from the impassable pressure behind my eyes, pushing outwards, threatening to dislodge them from their sockets. I stumbled from the table, my legs rubbery. The floorboards, usually firm and familiar, seemed to ripple beneath my weight, sending a nauseating wave through my gut. My breath caught in my throat, a ragged, useless sound. I needed air, but the air inside felt thick, viscous, like breathing through liquid glass. My skin crawled, a million phantom insects scuttling across my scalp, down my spine. It wasn't cold, but a profound emptiness of warmth, a chilling indifference that seeped into my very core. Pushing open the front door, I stepped outside. The sun, usually a welcome presence, hung in the sky like a bruised, swollen fruit, its light sickly and diffuse. The world had gone quiet. The usual chirping of insects, the distant bleating of sheep, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, all were gone. A profound, unnatural silence had fallen, broken only by the incessant thrumming that was now everywhere, a low, resonant hum that was not heard with the ears, but felt in the chest, the skull, the soles of my feet. I looked out over the remote village in valley, single road in and out. The familiar contours of the landscape had begun to subtly shift. The river, which usually glittered with sunlight, was a flat, dull ribbon, reflecting nothing, absorbing all light. My mind strained, trying to reconcile what my eyes saw with what my brain knew to be true. The discrepancy was a raw wound in my perception. Then the houses. Not crumbling, not falling apart, but changing. Their clapboard walls seemed to breathe, the wood grain rippling like water. A window pane, once a clear square, stretched, elongated, twisting into a parallelogram that defied perspective. It wasn't destruction. It was a resculpting, a quiet, horrifying redefinition of form. My hands clenched into useless fists. My fingernails dug into my palms, but I felt no pain, only a distant, dull pressure. The world was being unmade, not with fire or fury, but with a silent, indifferent precision. My gaze swept across the village, searching for movement, for a sign of human life, of recognition. A figure emerged from one of the transformed houses. It was a colleague, or what had been a colleague. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, their limbs seeming to articulate at impossible angles. Their face. It was still their face, but stretched, flattened, as if viewed through a warped lens. Their eyes, once warm and familiar, were now two deep, unblinking pools of something profoundly ancient and empty. They didn't scream. They didn't run. They simply were, in a form that was no longer human, no longer comprehensible. They weren't dead. They were realigned. My stomach lurched, and I fell to my knees, retching bile onto the warped ground. The grass beneath my hands felt like coarse wire, not living plant matter. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperate to unsee, to unfeel, to escape the silent, overwhelming reordering. But the thrum was inside me too, vibrating in my skull, rearranging the very thoughts in my head. When I opened my eyes again, the sky was no longer blue. It was a vast, pulsating canvas of impassable colors, hues that had no names, shifting and merging in patterns that defied geometry. Lines of light, sharp and precise, cut across the expanse, forming structures that hummed with a silent, terrible power. These were not clouds, not stars. They were the scaffolding of a new reality being erected before my very eyes. The entire valley, the entire earth, felt like it was being stretched thin, pressed flat, then folded into new, incomprehensible dimensions. It wasn't an attack, it was a correction. Our reality, our physics, our very existence, was a minor flaw in a grand, alien design, and it was being meticulously, silently overwritten. The colleague, or the thing that had been my colleague, turned its head towards me. Its mouth, now a vertical slit, opened slowly, but no sound emerged. Only the thrum intensified, echoing the silent scream of a world being reshaped. I was a speck, a remnant, clinging to a reality that was rapidly dissolving, being restitched into something vast and indifferent. What was I now, in this new, silent tapestry? The wood of the table began to splinter, not from impact, but from within, tiny fissures appearing along the grain as if under immense, invisible pressure. The thrumming intensified, a guttural groan that vibrated not just in my bones, but in the very foundation of the small, isolated structure. My ears popped, then rang with a high-pitched whine that threatened to shatter my eardrums. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair. The static on the dead receiver flared, a brief, blinding flash of white light, then darkness. Complete, absolute darkness. The power was gone. My breath hitched, a ragged rasp in my throat. The thrum was everywhere now, a silent, all-encompassing chord that stretched the very air thin. I could feel it in my lungs, each inhale a struggle against the vibrating pressure. My fingers, still tingling from the receiver's final surge, fumbled for the doorknob. The metal felt wrong, slick and yielding like old clay. I twisted, pushed, and lurched out into the night. The moon, when I finally saw it, was not the moon I knew. It hung low, bloated and bruised, shedding a sickly ochre light over the remote village in valley, single road in and out. The familiar shapes of the houses were softened, their edges blurred as if viewed through heat haze, yet the air was frigid. The thrum was here too, a palpable presence that made the ground beneath my feet tremble. I stared at the sky. The stars, usually a comforting blanket of pinpricks, were wrong. They shimmered with an unnatural intensity, not twinkling, but throbbing. Constellations I had mapped and memorized for decades were subtly, terrifyingly rearranged. An extra star here, a missing one there, a nebula stretched thin into an impassable filament. My mind tried to reconcile the images, to force them back into their correct patterns, but it was like trying to hold water in a sieve. The universe was shifting. A sound, or perhaps a lack of sound, drew my attention. The usual distant murmur of the village, a dog barking, a generator humming, the occasional cry of a night bird was gone. It was the baker, I thought, his silhouette unmistakable. He stood still, facing the bruised moon, his arms hanging limp at his sides. I started towards him, my legs heavy, my chest tight. "Hello," I called out, my voice thin and reedy against the vast quiet. He didn't move. As I drew closer, the moonlight illuminated him. His face was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the sky. But it wasn't just his stillness that unnerved me. It was his skin. It shimmered with the same faint, ochre light as the moon, an unsettling luminescence that seemed to emanate from within him. His clothes, too, seemed to ripple, their fabric shifting and reforming with each subtle thrum of the air. He was a living echo, a distortion. This wasn't just an observation, it was a fundamental wrongness. The world was being rewoven, thread by invisible thread, into something else entirely. The baker was not merely observing, he was part of the observation, a quiescent component of the new order. Was he aware? Did he feel the thrum within him, dissolving the very cells of his being? The thought was a spike of ice in my mind. I turned, scanning the village. Other figures stood in their doorways or in the middle of the dirt road, all facing the sky, all glowing faintly. Their forms were subtly elongated, their faces smoothed into expressions of vacant serenity. They were not screaming. They were not running. They were simply becoming. The single road in and out, the only path connecting this valley to the world beyond, stretched before me. I could see it twisting up into the hills, a thin, pale ribbon under the impassable moon. A desperate urge to flee, to outrun the silent, pervasive change, surged through me. But even as the thought formed, the road itself seemed to waver. It no longer looked like an asphalt path. It led not out, but into. My determination, once a burning ember, flickered. I had sought knowledge, pulled at the threads of existence, and now reality itself was unraveling around me. My eyes burned. My head throbbed in rhythm with the cosmic hum. The air grew thick, like breathing through wet wool, heavy with the metallic tang of ozone and something else, something ancient and sterile, like the dust of creation. I looked at my hand. It was translucent, the faint ochre light of the moon filtering through my skin, outlining the bones beneath. My fingers seemed to stretch, growing longer, more delicate, less substantial. The thrumming in my marrow intensified, becoming less a vibration and more a gentle, continuous pull. It was not painful, not exactly. It was an invitation, a dissolution. It was not light as I understood it, but an emanation of pure, incomprehensible being. It was the signal made manifest, not as sound or wave, but as the very fabric of everything. My sense of self, Marcus, the astrophysicist, the man who sought answers, began to fray. My thoughts became less my own, more echoes in a vast, expanding chamber. The fear receded, replaced by a terrifying, profound understanding. This wasn't destruction. It was a correction, a realignment. The universe wasn't ending. It was simply being set right, according to a logic that dwarfed all human comprehension. We were the anomalies, the discordant notes, and now we were being tuned. I felt myself expanding, dissolving, merging with the thrum, with the ochre light, with the silent, watchful figures of the village. My body became a conduit, my consciousness a mere whisper in the immense chorus of the newly ordered reality. The single road in and out was no longer a path, but a shimmering vein, coursing with the same fundamental energy that now flowed through me. I was no longer Marcus, isolated in a valley. I was a part of the valley, a part of the road, a part of the sky, a part of the infinite, silent hum. And the universe, finally, was truly quiet. What could possibly be left to hear?